everyone. Welcome to another edition of Real Talk presented by Let's Talk America Radio. I am Shayna Thornton, your on-air host and executive producer of the award-winning program, and super excited to be with you today. It's one of my favorite days. Today, we recognize a very important federal and state holiday. It's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day around the United States of America. And today, we're going to put the spotlight on the legacy of Dr. King. And he was such an epic figure of civil rights and a peace advocate and so much more. And today is an important conversation. It's a brief one, but we want you to stay with us. Now, I am no expert on the life of Dr. King. I greatly admire him, but I have an expert on with us right now. She's an acclaimed historian, the one and only Dr. Tara White. She is the assistant professor of history at University of North Carolina at Wilmington. Dr. White, thank you for being on with us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here again.
We always have great in-depth conversations with you. Today's not going to be too long, but I think it's going to be a very meaningful conversation. We do encourage all of our listeners and viewers to share this episode with family and friends, and especially our youth. But we have a tradition here on Let's Talk America Radio's edition of Real Talk, Dr. White, where we ask our exclusive guests in 2 minutes or less to really explain what got you here. Now, I know you're an acclaimed award-winning historian. I know your work is extensive in Black studies, but as a child, did anything spark you to say, one day I'm going to be a great professor and I'm going to be able to really teach and educate community members about the rich history of African Americans and women?
No, I was a science major. I wanted to be a medical doctor actually until up through my junior year college. And it was then that I realized that my real interest was in access to healthcare for poor people, and decided that I was going to do something else. And just by a fluke, I ended up working with a museum as an intern, and decided at the end of that internship to go to graduate school for history and museum studies. But I've always been interested in African-American history and culture. I've always been an advocate for Black people. I've always had a love for our history, and in fact, just really active and activist in my orientation. Two of my college friends just called me the Milton Midgett. So. But that's always been my orientation. I grew up in Montgomery, Alabama, and so I understood the power of direct action and the power of the civil rights movement. And I grew up hearing stories about my grandmother, who actually was a divorcee, working mom, and having to walk to work and deciding to walk to work as opposed to riding the buses during the bus boycott. And so grew up hearing those stories. And what was so powerful later was that my great grandmother was still living during the bus boycott. My great grandmother, who was born during Reconstruction. And yes, and she was still alive, and she was blind. She was a diabetic, and she had gone blind as a result of her diabetes. And she would listen to Montgomery had the only TV station, major station they had at the time was the NBC affiliate, right? It was called WSFA, but it was the NBC affiliate. And she would listen to the news on the television. We were only people on the block who had a TV. And she would listen to the news and encourage my grandmother, who was working a full-time job, who was taking care of her children and her sister's children, and also caring for her mother. And her mother would encourage her to not ride the buses. She said, Black people are trying to do something. We are trying to get from under the yoke of bondage. She encouraged my grandmother to walk and to catch rides. And that's what she did. And thankfully, I grew up in a church that was also involved in the bus boycott, Bryant Missionary Baptist Church in Montgomery is my home church, the church where I grew up in on the west side of Montgomery. And West Montgomery, was a big place for those folks who were active in the bus boycott. A lot of the preachers, the churches, the people, people like E.D. Nixon didn't live that far from me. People like Lucille Times didn't live that far from me. People like Rosa Parks didn't live that far from me, right? And so, their homes, all of that was on our side of town, right? And all of those people lived in our neighborhoods. And so these were the folks who inspired my love of history. I never thought I'd make it a profession. I never thought I'd make it my profession.
Well, I am elated with joy that you did make it your profession because you're so passionate about it, as it shows. You mentioned the boycott, you mentioned the buzzword of preachers, and of course, we're talking one of the most renowned preachers from the Southeast, and of course, that's the late great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Today is January the 17th, 2022, and the United States of America is recognizing this day with an official holiday. And so many people have the day off, Dr. White, you know that, and it's a day off from school for many kids, and they sometimes they're still just gaming. There's nothing additional. In many parts of the country, some parades or other events may have been canceled due to some recent weather issues that a lot of the East Coast recently saw. That's why I think it's important to have this brief conversation today about the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Talk to me right now. So many people say, well, we know about his life, but I want, as a historian, for you to talk about really the reputation of this great man that existed and thrived, if you will, at the beginning during that famous boycott, where he, in so many words, came on the scene to many, and then compare it to, of course, the tragic assassination that happened April of 1968. Is there a comparison? Was there a difference in how people received him then?
Oh, very much so. People hated him. People hated King, and I think that's America has a real interesting relationship to our memory. Our historic memory is always very short. During his lifetime, so King rose in prominence not because he was actually, he was not jockeying for power or whatever. It's one of those kinds of things where, you miss the meeting and they make you the chair, right? And so it was something similar to that. He was elected president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, partly because he didn't have any connections to the people in town, right? He was from somewhere else. Most of the other pastors who were there, Dexter was a prestigious church, and so was First Baptist. First Baptist, of course, one of the oldest Black Baptist churches in the city of Montgomery, and like I said, also very prestigious. But Ralph Abernathy had family in the area. He was from Alabama. He was from the Black Belt, right? And so he had connections there that would have made it, not that it made King's position, any more comfortable, but he didn't have family inside Alabama, right? And so within the reach of, people who wanted to do them harm, because that's really one of the lessons that we miss when we think about the civil rights movement. We glamorize it and glorify it, and people are out there and they have their pickets and whatever. And we're never really fully given a sense of the danger that those people are in. And that was something that was very real in the lives of people like King and Abernathy and anyone else who dared to stand up for equal rights or for justice for African Americans. One of the things that is not said enough is that white supremacy was always supported by violence. There was always violence to back it up. It needed violence to be upheld. And so that was a real part of of everybody's life. And so King steps into this role.
Dr. White, I don't want to interrupt you, but it is fair to say that violence part translated into intimidation to keep people at bay.
It was both. It was both. Not just, it was intimidation and violence. Yeah, no, not just intimidation. No, 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 no. Not just intimidation. There was violence. In fact, one of the big events in King's life, if you go to Montgomery, and I'm actively campaigning at this point. If you go to Montgomery, go visit the King Parsonage, which is the house where the King family lived, and in his early, because Dexter was his first church. And he and his family and this little girl, by that point, Yolanda, had been born, and they lived in the parsonage for Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And the house was bombed. And his wife and his daughter were in the house. Yes, there was a bomb left on the porch, cratered out the porch. And King was, of course you get paranoid. And he started staying up, and he even got to the place where he had a gun. And because now the truth is that, one of the things that we assume is that everybody involved in the movement was nonviolent, and that's not the case. King promoted nonviolence, and he studied Gandhian nonviolence and the power of nonviolent direct action in making change in India. And so he wanted to apply that same kind of thing here in the United States. But not everybody who was around him believed in nonviolence in the way he did. And so some people got him a gun. And there's a woman in Montgomery, Mrs. Shirley Cherry, who used to run the tours at the house. And she talks, persuasively about how he came to a place, he had a conversation with God, and he came to a place where he decided that either he was going to carry the gun and do that, or he was really going to walk out his faith and walk out the belief in nonviolence. And so King came to that place in Montgomery where he decided, in the face of violence, and his house was not the only one bombed. The Abernathy's home was bombed. The Gratzes, they were a young white couple, Lutherans, and Reverend Gratz, Reverend and Mrs. Gratz, in fact, both just died within the last couple years or so. Lovely, lovely people. Practiced Christianity, because everybody who says that they're Christian don't practice Christianity. They practice Christianity, and some of the most loving people you will ever meet. But their home was bombed. A whole lot of bombings, whole lot of violence against folks. And they stood in the face of this violence. And so King came into that. But again, African Americans had known that standing up to Jim Crow would result in intimidation and violence. Yes. And they got to see that firsthand during the movement.
Wow. So you clearly laid a picture. You said, unfortunately, the way I see it, that towards the end of his life, his work was significant. To me, I think of the great speeches he did and the great address to the sanitation workers right before his untimely death by assassination. But you're saying that people received him different, at least some people, or perhaps a group.
Well, yes. And so back to that, people were not receptive. And so, we have this idea of the movement as receptive to all African Americans were on board, and that's not the case. There were quite a few, even within his own church. And King, Montgomery society, if you had to compare movements, Montgomery's was very different from Birmingham. Montgomery, King was from the upper middle class, Black folks, very well educated. His church represented upper middle class Black people, most who were very, well educated, most of whom were members of, quite a few of them were faculty members at Alabama State. college, and HBCU there in Montgomery. And so these were, the Black upper class and upper middle class folks, right?
Okay.
And quite a few of them did not support the movement. Now, the thing that I will say is that Dexter, and that was one of the reasons he ends up leaving Montgomery, is because folks are a little bit tentative about the movement activities and whatever. And now this was not abnormal, because his predecessor, Vernon Johns, had been pushed out because of his fiery tone too.
I want to ask you about this, and if you're just catching us or tuning in on a replay, you're watching the award-winning Let's Talk America Radio, our edition of Real Talk. It is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and we are celebrating and highlighting the life and legacy of this great human being and all that he did and the many sacrifices. We're digging deep into his legacy, in particular being received and how he was received throughout his life. And so obviously for many of you watching us, you're thinking, well, how we view him today. Dr. Tara White, of course, assistant professor of history at UNC at Wilmington, is breaking down the time period that he was in, that he advocated and preached in and marched in and led and coordinated and really made a lot of personal sacrifices in. As she so beautifully said, white supremacy was not only intimidating, but it was also violent. And so that's not an easy task to take on. And yet he made so many sacrifices, and truly altruism at its best, if you ask me, Dr. White. But you touched on something that very few people would touch on. And I do want us to focus just on that to put things in context. You did point out that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. did come from an upper middle class family. He was educated. We know he went to Morehouse. I mean, those were opportunities that, is it fair to say, majority of African Americans in the Southeast did not obviously experience. And you said that the church, he was at Dexter Church, his first church that he had the opportunity to pastor, they were not supportive of his involvement in the movement. My question is, sometimes we don't address that. When it came down to those who did want to stop or halt segregation, or those who wanted to act on it and do other things, such as King and Ralph Abernathy and the many others who put in the time and the sweat and the genius work behind it, do you think that maybe based off of income or status in segregated America, do you think that translated into people's motives? I mean, it's a question really probably based on humanity and sociology and not so much of history. And it's a fair question.
But I think for a lot of folks, people keep in mind that the folks who were the people who were members of Dexter, and I'm not, and let me make sure that I'm clear that I'm not saying that the majority of people at Dexter did not support him. Yeah. That's not what I'm saying. So the Dexter people won't be calling me. But what I will say is that there were quite a few folks at Dexter who did not support him. Okay. And that's fair to say. And not just him, other folks who were active in the movement there as well. What I will say for those folks is that in many cases they had jobs that where people could apply pressure, right? And so if you work, for example, we see this in State Teachers College for Negroes at the time. What we know as ASU, trained teachers, right? Teachers work for local governments. And so they were vulnerable because they worked for entities where people could apply political pressure and get rid of them. And in fact, quite a few of those folks who did participate in the bus boycott, for example, Joanne Gibson Robinson was a faculty member at Alabama State. One of the leaders of the Women's Political Council, was a member of Dexter, right? And she was one of the folks swept out of her job after the Attorney General at the time, John Patterson, cracked down on folks who had been activists, right? And who worked for these state agencies. And so they pushed out quite a few folks. They pushed out Joanne Robinson. They pushed out renowned historian L.D. Reddick, Lawrence D. Reddick, who was the chair of the history department at Alabama State, had been one of the former chairs of the Schomburg. He had been director of the Schomburg. He was one of the leading lights in the Sala and a protege of Carter Woodson, right? He got pushed out because he was supporting the boycott, and there were quite a few folks who ended up losing jobs and losing positions because of their support of the boycott. And so people understood that, and that was what made quite a few folks kind of wary about participating in civil rights activities. In Alabama in particular, if you were a teacher, they recreated, and especially after Brown, they restructured the laws so that, state boards of education had very wide latitude and lots of power in the years after Brown, not only to keep folks from trying to integrate, but also to punish Black teachers who stepped out of line. And so this was the beginning of, what we now see as the closure of Black schools and dislocation of Black faculty and Black teachers. And this is a result of civil rights activities. And so these people were folks people who had mortgages and people who had children and in school and college, and people who had they had responsibilities, and that's as an adult, you want to take care of your family.
I see. And that's just a real life component, I think sometimes is not spoken. And I think you're right. I think you sort of insinuated there's this notion that everybody was on board with Dr. King, that everybody was a part of the civil rights movement. And the fact is, we may have people in our families in our village now that were not. I mean, history tells a different story, right? You were on the right side of history when maybe they weren't as adamant about it. I've, throughout my career, have had the opportunity to speak with people who will often tell me that they've had grandparents or aunts and uncles that said, oh, desegregation was the worst thing ever, because they were, their words, not always speaking directly to those people, but they said, oh, they were better off. And I often think overall, who are we talking about was better off? And to your point, and of course, we're not throwing shade or criticizing people harshly, but they're looking at it perhaps as what was best for me financially, perhaps what was best for my lifestyle, and not overall for the progression of a race and group of people.
Let me give you, and this person is still very much alive, so I cannot tell who, but when I was, like I said, I was, as my friends call me the Milton Midgett. And so, of course, when I started interning at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, and I remember talking to someone and telling them that, I could not even imagine that anyone would not participate with, the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. And I can't imagine that anyone would not support Reverend Shuttlesworth. And I can't imagine, and the Alabama Christian Movement folks, I couldn't imagine that anyone would. And this person flat out told me, sweetie, you are, at the time, I was probably 21 years old. You are 21 years old. You don't have a house. You don't have a car. I didn't even have a car. You don't have expenses. You don't have a family. These people had families to support, right? Mm-hmm. These people had mortgages. So for you to, who are you to judge these people, and who are you to say, that you would have done X, Y, Z? No, you didn't live then. And so it's unfair for you to judge them. You don't have the expenses they had, right? Wow. And this is, for some people, these things could have been career defining, could have ended their careers, right? No, so you need to not be so harsh in your
Yeah.
judgment. Now,
Yeah.
the truth is, it is an individual thing and whatever. And as someone who's much older now, I understand the position now. As someone who's principled, um, yeah, I still would have lost my job. But yeah, but that's me.
Yeah.
That's
And there
me,
were many,
right?
and there were many that did that. Let's point that out. Not
Yeah,
everybody was not the same. And I think
that's right.
that's so important as people represent their own voice. And we know that today with groups of African Americans, we do not all think alike, and we
That's
never
right.
have.
Not
And there
monolithic.
Yeah, and there is power in diversity of thoughts. But
Yes.
thank you for clearing that up and addressing what I think is often a sensitive subject, the elephant in the room that a lot of people don't touch on because we want to assume everybody was for nonviolence, everybody was for desegregation, everybody was for, and that was not the case.
And there were people now, and it's important for us to keep in mind there were people who supported behind the scenes.
Yes,
I will
yes,
say that for example, if you look at the in the Birmingham movement, I know for a fact there was a woman that I done a lot of work on, named Lucinda Roby. And
okay,
Mrs. Roby was actually was a teacher and got promoted during the movement. She was one of the founders of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. One of the original incorporators, was an officer the entire time, had been involved in the NAACP, was a life member, and was proud to say, and was a principal, promoted to a principal. But Mrs. Roby, and she was just principled that way. If she would dare she would dare her people to fire her, every other week. But I will say that there were plenty of folks who gave her money, and because she was not alive when I started studying her, other
okay.
people I knew or knew who knew her would say, well, I wasn't really involved because I had a family and I tried to keep my job and blah, 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 but we would give money, and so there are quite a few people, because the movement would not have survived without
Correct.
people who were given behind the scenes, who were not out in the open supporting, who were able to surreptitiously support. And in fact, there were some cases where the surreptitious support, that behind the scenes support was
Yes.
really what was needed, to make
That's
sure that
wonderful.
things were successful, right?
And I think anyone who's ever been a part of movements or organizations can testify to your point that it takes all of it, right? It does take financing, right? It's the elephant in the room that people don't want to talk about, but you do need funds to keep
Yes.
movements and organizations going,
Yes.
and for people to help. And I'm sure you have the leaders like Dr. Keene and others who are very appreciative of that. As
Yes.
we begin to wrap up this important conversation about the legacy of Dr. King and the civil rights movement here in the United States, Dr. White, of course, is on with us. She's assistant professor of history at UNC, University of North Carolina at Wilmington. Great institution there, and you're doing some great work in educating our students and out and advocating the beautiful, rich history of African Americans and women's. And we thank you so much for that. King's legacy today. Have we gotten it right in pop culture? I want to
No,
ask a historian that because
no,
and it sounds
no,
like you're already giving us an F.
no.
And what are we doing wrong? And tell us as we begin to wrap up this conversation, how can we get it right? How can we turn the tables?
So a couple things with so today he is beloved. He's an icon. He's an icon on the left and on the right. People think he is wonderful, and they talk about the wonderful legacy and all of that. And what I loved about my my historian colleagues on Twitter is, they've been going in for the last couple of days about his legacy, right? And quoting speeches. Of course, the media darling and the favorite thing for people on the right and the left, quote is the whole notion of, my little children, I want my children to be judged by the not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, right? And so that's really quoted a whole lot, but people miss the entire speech in Washington, D.C. They missed that what King was doing was calling out he was calling out the fact that America had yet to live up to its creed, and now this is the creed that America said. This is what America said it was,
Yes.
and America had yet to live up to what it said it was, and that was and he used this metaphor of the bounce check, right?
Yeah.
That America's written this check, and this check is bouncing because it doesn't what it says it is, it is not, right? And the other part of this is that that we were swinging into, this is 63, and so Vietnam is happening at that time, and you have King, who is looking at, but not really speaking directly to Vietnam right then, but we're spending millions and millions and millions of dollars on these wars in our anti-communism efforts, and we have people at home who are starving, right? People who are living in shacks, people who don't have clothes on their backs and whatever. And so that's hypocrisy, right? In a nation that is supposed to be founded on Christian principles, right? And in a nation that is supposed to be majority of followers of Jesus, Jesus who admonished us to take care of the poor and the sick among us, right? And Jesus who admonished us to care for the least of these, and that as whatever we did to the least of these, that we were doing to him, right? And so he called out that hypocrisy in that speech. And so in the same text, right, that they cherry pick and pull this one piece, you have a whole lot of other stuff that's left. And so he critiques capitalism and the capitalism that doesn't see humanity, right?
Okay.
He critiques the inhumanity of man against man through that violence and through the not living up to the Constitution that had guaranteed African Americans the right to vote, the right to due process, the right to equal protection under the law, the right to equal protection before the law, right? And so he critiques all of those things that you saw, and he critiqued, not being able to vote, right? We here are American citizens who are paying taxes and cannot choose their leaders, and what's wrong with that picture? Or watch this. He because the civil rights bill was being filibustered, right? And filibuster is a word that most of us know today, because we see the same thing that happened then happening now, where you have the senators who are threatening a filibuster. And so you have this was one of the quotes that one of the things that he said. You have a minority of senators who are upholding or actually trying to stand in the way of the vote for minority of citizens. And how ironic is that, right? Right. And so he was on it. He was on it in the prophetic sense, right? In the true prophetic sense of Black preachers, and that's he comes out of that tradition. He's second, third generation preacher, and that Black prophetic tradition was really alive there with King, and he continued that tradition of speaking truth to power. He continued that tradition tradition of, as the preachers would say, making the comfortable uncomfortable, right? And so he continued that tradition, because if you're doing it right, the comfortable are definitely gonna be uncomfortable. And so King continued that tradition of criticizing the people in power. And again, that is a prophetic tradition. If we look at the prophets of the Bible, from Elijah to Jeremiah, and even up to Jesus, they were critical of power, right?
Yeah.
And they criticized the places where power did not recognize humanity. And that was what King did oh so well. And
did.
he used scripture as his text. And that was the other thing that he did so well. But he was not revered. You would think that, the religious bodies would have thought of him as not just an amazing preacher, but also as a person who was a person who really did rely on the prophetic text to do that, and they were not. Most churches criticized him. Most religious bodies criticized him. Even the National Baptist Convention, the National Baptist Convention tried to embrace that, but no, the National Baptist Convention leadership was not supportive of King at all.
He was a Baptist preacher.
And he was a Baptist preacher.
Yeah. From originally from Atlanta, Georgia, of course.
That's right.
And strong history and respect for him, of course, in the city of Atlanta, and throughout the world. Now, we certainly know that. Dr. White, what in an eye-opening conversation touched on avenues most people don't consider a highlight? I hope this conversation allows family units to really expand on the legacy of Dr. King and where we can go from here. Speaking of that, give us one thing that a parent, an aunt, or grandparent, a godmother, or godfather, or a neighbor, or an educator, or teacher can do moving forward for us to properly capture the legacy and the impact of King for our youth. Tie that, because this as much as you know about Dr. King, as much as I respect and celebrate his life. What does it mean if that's not properly being translated to our children, the next generation? One thing that you would give that guardian or that loving village supporter to carry on with the child?
I would give them this, and this is a really hard thing, and a hard thing to do. It's hard to be in a place where you're the lone voice for right? It is
Yes.
hard. It's hard to be the only person, the voice crying in the wilderness, if you will, right?
Yeah.
But there are times in our lives where we must be that lone voice crying in the wilderness, right? And we must understand, as the Lord told, as the Lord told Elijah when he was in the cave running from Jezebel, because he was one of the few who had stood up to Jezebel and had not bowed down to Baal and kissed his ring. And the word of God said, God told him, but there are 10,000 who have not done. You are not the only one. And so the thing that I would tell people is to encourage your children to stand in the hard place, right? And do the right thing when it's not comfortable to do the right thing. Be willing to do the right thing. My grandmother always told us that, to always do right and to know that right don't wrong nobody. That was exactly how she said it, do right and right don't wrong nobody. And so there are times when we have to stand alone, but it's a measure of character to be that person and to be willing to stand by yourself when you're doing the right thing, right? And to know that whether, and this is, not necessarily a historical position, but this is a spiritual position. And whether people recognize that or not, you have to know, right, that you got to sleep at night. You have to look at your face in the mirror every single day. You have to sleep at night, and you need to know in your heart of hearts that you've done the right thing. And that's what you encourage your children to do. Do the right thing, even when it's hard to do the right thing. I think that's the legacy. That's one legacy of King. And that's one, as we're training our children to be people of character and integrity, right? That we let them know that it's not always easy to do the right thing, but you do right anyway.
Yeah, such a powerful point to end on, even when it's unpopular, and that's what Dr. King and many in his circle and others throughout the world have done at different stages throughout history. It's not always easy, right? People sometimes have a natural tendency to want to be accepted, to be liked. But sometimes that lonely road is truly the best road for you because sometimes, and you want to do it because it's the right thing to do, but sometimes many years from history, you realize the one that stood out who was able to give that lonely cry, history would eventually get it right. And we see that they stood up for what was certainly right. What a poignant conversation that we have to continue to have, not just on King Day, not just for Black History Month in February, but I think it's a conversation we have to integrate around family tables more and more, Dr. White. And we've got to get the experts like you in front of people to really spark that conversation and bring truth to it so we can make sure those conversations are meaningful and we can pass it on 100 and 200 years from now. Thank you again, the one and only Dr. Tara White. Of course, she is assistant professor of history at University of North Carolina at Wilmington, a wonderful institution of higher learning. North Carolina, a special place in my heart. Thank you so much. For those that are watching, you were, of course, witnessing Let's Talk America Radio, our Real Talk edition. Today is Dr. King's official holiday. Of course, his actual birthday, from right, Dr. White, was January the 15th, actually. Yes. But we celebrated officially in the United States today, which is a federal holiday and a state holiday, and of course, majority of the states now. So we will continue to honor his legacy. Did you have anything to say, Dr. White?
Today, actually, yes, the 15th was his birthday, but today is actually the birthday of, speaking truth to power and walking alone, Muhammad Ali.
Oh, what a great historical figure we know. And we've got to have you back on and have a conversation about him and his place in athletics, but also his voice throughout history, because he was quite a unique human being and how he was standing up and speaking what he saw as his truth, even when it was very unpopular and even when it cost him things in his most important part of his boxing career. To a large degree, many will argue. I'm a great sports fan and historical sports figures I do take a great interest in. So that'll be a great conversation. See, another reason to bring you back, Dr. White. But thank you everyone for watching us. We hope you continue to have a wonderful King Day, a great January, and continue. Of course, I have to do this because we do a lot of health segments. Please continue to take COVID serious, okay? We are not out of the woodworks. Make the best decisions for you and your family. But this virus is continuing to thrive. So make sure you're making logical decisions to keep you as safe as possible, because we care about each of you. We want you on board to continue to be inspired, motivated, and informed. And that's the mission of Let's Talk America Radio. For additional information, please visit ltaradio.com. That's ltaradio.com, or follow us on social media, hashtag LTA Radio. Before we get out of here, Dr. White, can you give your contact information for those individuals that want to connect or reach out? We have to do that.
Yes, absolutely. You can reach me at by email at Dr. Tara White, Dr. Tara WHITE @gmail.com.
Awesome. I love it. So keep this conversation going. She is very responsive. So if you've got a question that your teenager wants to ask, or someone in college, or a full-blown adult, because as bright as we think we are, we don't know everything about every sect of history. And I continue to always be fascinated about the true heritage and the essence and richness of African-American studies and women's studies. So fascinating. And it has a place in our society today that just does not touch on women and African Americans, but world history. I'm a clear advocate of that. Dr. White, thank you. Thank you to all of our viewers and listeners. Continue to tune in, tag someone in our comment section, and we want to continue to have you tuned in. Have a great day. Take care, everybody. Thank you, Dr. White.
Thank you.